Now, as we've just seen, nearly 12 million Australians woke up in lockdown this morning. 12 million. Every Victorian, along with residents of Greater Sydney, adjoining regions, told to stay home to help stop the spread of the Delta variant. And while Daniel Andrews defends his decision to go hard and go fast, Gladys Berejiklian continues to resist pressure at this stage to tighten Sydney's lockdown by shutting retail and limiting essential work. But I heard from Kerry Chant today, the Chief Health Officer in New South Wales, and there was very little infection occurring in luxury retail. So that call is a little bit hollow when you compare it to the actual evidence. For their analysis of the situations in both Sydney and Victoria, I want to bring in two of the best journalists in the business from the Australian newspaper. From Melbourne, Victorian political reporter Rachel Baxendale, and in Sydney, New South Wales State political reporter Yoni Bashan. Rachel, Yoni, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Rachel, can I start with you? The Victorian Premier, he has used lockdown as his first option to move the way he did after just 18 cases. Was that your expectation?
Look, yesterday was interesting. I think there was actually some hesitation. We were hearing on Wednesday night into yesterday that a lockdown of 3 to 5 days was on the cards. There was then some hesitation, and the messages coming out of the Andrews government privately were that they were initially holding off on going into that. And then I think it wasn't the number of cases, it was the nature of cases that determined that decision, and the fact that they had seen that very obvious evidence of transmission of the virus between strangers at a mass event in the form of the footy match at the MCG at the members' stand. We're now at least 6 cases from that, and some of those cases have passed it on to other family members. And the other venue of concern that's only emerged today, and in some ways is possibly more concerning, because at least at the MCG we know exactly who was there. It was a ticketed event. But the other venue is Young and Jackson, the iconic Melbourne hotel across the road from Flinders Street Station. We've got at least 2 cases out of that, in addition to the 2 other people who we know were there. Of course, we had the man in his 60s from the REL Apartments building who caught it when his neighbours were being assisted by those 3 removalists from Sydney. And we did also see 4 generations of transmission in just 6 days. We had the removalists who passed it on to the man in his 60s, who passed it on to his friend who he went to the footy with, and that friend's now passed it on to at least 4 teachers at Bacchus Marsh Grammar and at least 3 family members in Bowen Heads down past Geelong. So okay. I think it was the rate at which it was spreading that was really what persuaded Daniel Andrews to make that decision. All
right. Meanwhile, Yoni, in Sydney, I get the feeling that Gladys Berejiklian is getting very, very frustrated with what's occurring with those numbers in southwestern Sydney. What's your feeling about what her next move might be? To make restrictions tougher in those areas only?
That would seem to be the most obvious course of direction from here. I mean, in New South Wales, the great problem right now is that of southwestern Sydney. That appears to be the epicentre of where the virus is spreading, although there are cases that are emerging in local health districts outside of that. But so the Berejiklian government is essentially facing a very difficult choice of whether to trust its current settings, even though community-based infections remain stubbornly high, or whether to impose further restrictions on those areas that present the greatest problem. Now, I've spoken to some well-placed officials today, this was a couple of hours ago, who told me that there hadn't been a formal proposal put to the crisis cabinet for a further lockdown of the southwestern suburbs. I understand there may have been some developments in the last hour or so that still need to be confirmed. Suffice it to say that course of action would certainly be one that officials would be thinking about. I mean, who wouldn't be thinking about that? It's an obvious consideration, given that infections are emerging in that particular region of Sydney. And so it would seem that that's the obvious direction for New South Wales to head if the numbers do not get under control.
Yeah, that's the point. It's moving very quickly. I got the feeling there's still competition going on, Rachel, between Daniel Andrews and Gladys Berejiklian. Like, you've got a situation where he calls this the Sydney variant. And then you got Gladys the other day scoffing at the idea that Dan handled last year's lockdown well.
Absolutely. I mean, I got the sense yesterday that Daniel Andrews was enjoying the situation to some extent, in that, you know, his line about the virus having started in New South Wales and it's gonna end here. It is a really interesting juxtaposition, and watching from Victoria, the situation in New South Wales at the moment is really interesting. You know, we made a huge number of mistakes last year. We of course had our 112-day lockdown. We have learnt a bit from that. There have been some key personnel changes in the health department down here, which gives me some optimism that this will be, I hope, a short and sharp lockdown. But it is interesting. I mean, a lot of the patterns and mistakes that we made last year, New South Wales seems to be repeating in terms of if you're going to lock down, then go hard, I think, because otherwise, what's the point of people locking down? And it does appear. I mean, this is spreading amongst essential workers who are still going to work in the lockdown. In the way that it did in Victoria last year. It's into hospitals now, it's into aged care facilities. Yep. And I just really hope that New South Wales health authorities look at some of the mistakes we made down here and learn from them. I guess the only thing that gives us some cause for optimism is that a lot of those people in hospitals and aged care facilities are now immunised, but I guess just everyone, all of us, has to get immunised as soon as we can, so that we stop having these lockdowns.
Absolutely. Yoni, just very quickly, people need to understand the areas we're talking about if they don't know them. Fairfield, Liverpool, Canterbury, Bankstown. Lots of migrant families who have very strong family and extended family links and who work day and night and travel right around the metro area, don't they?
That's absolutely right. So it's not just the epicentre of the infections, it's the epicentre of working class Sydney. These are notionally Labor heartland areas, and they're areas where a number of migrants and ethnically diverse communities reside, but people with very large families. And as one would expect, during the first couple of weeks on the lockdown, the messaging around these stay-at-home orders wasn't particularly clear, and so people quite rightly would have ventured outside of their homes and would have visited extended family and relatives, and only later on were they discovering this was actually prohibited and verboten, and they shouldn't have been doing that. And so it seems to me that the first 2 weeks of the lockdown in Sydney was actually somewhat of a waste of time. We didn't do it properly. Some people were calling it a mockdown, and we're only getting the true effects of a proper lockdown now.
Yep, exactly. We won't see the benefits of that probably for another week now, because that first 2 weeks was a waste of time. Anyway, Rachel Baxendale, Yoni Bashan, thank you so much for your time this evening.